Good morning, Ms. Hofmeyer. Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Chair.
Are we ready?
We are indeed, Chair.
Sure.
If I may just commence, there are two sets of legal representatives here today, and I'd like to ask that they just place themselves on record before we commence.
Yes, let's do that. Morning, please come over here.
My name is John Ngebecha from Ngebecha Madlanga Attorneys in Sandton. We are
Thank
here
you.
on behalf of Mr. Tsotsi to assist.
Mr. Tsotsi.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Morning, Judge. My name is Mbulelo Ndlovu, and we're here on behalf of Waita Mapude.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Today we are continuing with what we have been calling the TNA evidence. And I thought just at the outset, before we begin with Mr. Tsotsi, who is our first witness today, I might just recap where we ended off last time on the evidence so that I can place it in the context of the evidence for the next 2 days. Chair, the evidence on TNA was focusing on state-owned enterprises and their contracts with TNA from the time that the company really started functioning in 2011 until about 2017, when it was sold and then in the process of liquidation. Chair, previously in the 2 days that we dealt with this evidence last year, we focused on Eskom. And we heard the evidence of 3 witnesses dealing with, in the case of Eskom, there were 3 contracts that were concluded from about 2012 onwards until 2014. And we heard the evidence of first Mr. Pretorius, then Mr. Chweyu, and then Mr. Pamensky. Today we will conclude the Eskom evidence with our first witness, who is Mr. Tsotsi, who at relevant points in time was both a member of the board of Eskom and then chair of the board of Eskom. Once we conclude Mr. Tsotsi's evidence, we will move to the evidence in relation to Transnet. And in respect of Transnet, we similarly have 3 further witnesses. We hope to at least start with one of them today, depending on how things go with Mr. Tsotsi, and then we will have 2 further witnesses tomorrow. Chair, as I mentioned at the outset when we started the TNA evidence, some of the witnesses who are being called and are going to be questioned about the TNA contracts are witnesses who have insights on other matters falling within the mandate of the Commission. But this session is focusing on the TNA aspects. And so that certainly applies to Mr. Tsotsi, it applied to Mr. Pamensky, and one of the witnesses tomorrow, Mr. Mkwanazi, is another witness who we will be focusing on TNA aspects with, but there is certainly an intention for the other aspects on which they have direct knowledge to be dealt with in other evidence.
Okay.
Chair, the final point to make on TNA is there's a last SOE in respect of which TNA evidence will be led. And that evidence will actually be led at the commencement of the next aviation session of evidence. That will look finally and in conclusion at the subscription agreements that SAA engaged in with TNA. And the witness there will be Mr. Corner, who at the relevant point in time was chairperson of the board of SAA, and then he was moved to the position of chief executive. So he will actually commence the aviation evidence dealing with TNA and dealing with certain other matters that he's brought to the attention of the Commission. And at that point, the Commission's investigations into the state-owned enterprises contracts with TNA will have been concluded. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
If I may then request that Mr. Tsotsi be sworn in.
Please administer the oath or affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Zola Tsotsi.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No, I don't.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes, I do.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you.
Chair, Mr. Tsotsi has provided an affidavit to the Commission.
Yes.
He also previously gave a statement to the Portfolio Committee when it was investigating matters of Eskom in 2018 and 2017 and 2018. And so the bundle which we request be marked Exhibit MM6 contains first his affidavit, then his statement to the Portfolio Committee, and then a series of relevant documents thereafter.
Yes. Mr. Andile Zola Tsotsi's affidavit and documents in the Liver Arch file in which that affidavit is will be marked Exhibit MM6.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Tsotsi, just to orientate you for the purposes of the evidence, what you have directly in front of you is MM6. It's the exhibit which contains your affidavit, your statement, as I've indicated, and a series of additional documents that I'll take you to today. Also available to you are a series of other files which comprise the full set of witness evidence in relation to TNA. And that's made available to you because there may be points in the evidence where a document lives in one of those files that I'll need to take you to. And I'll identify them by the exhibit number, which you see on their spines. Mr. Tsotsi, I noted from your affidavit and from your statement to Parliament that you indicated in both of them that you'd been asked to give an account of certain events years after you'd left Eskom, and certainly without the benefit of certain documents available to you. Is that correct?
Correct.
What I wanted to say in that regard is that the Commission's investigations have certainly taken that limitation seriously. We have been sourcing documents from Eskom where they become relevant to the matters at hand. Previous witnesses have been taken to them. I intend to take you to those documents today. But we are well aware that some of those documents might not have been seen by you for some time. And so please do indicate at any point if you'd like extra time to look at documents, if you'd like to consider them in context, we'll certainly take that into account in the course of the evidence.
Thank you.
The other thing is just audibility, Mr. Tsotsi. Will you just endeavor to bring your microphone as close as possible to where you are? It's very important that we get a good recording of these proceedings for our transcript, which I think now must be in hundreds of thousands of pages, Chair.
It is hundreds of
It
thousands,
is.
yeah.
Oh. Mr. Tsotsi, if I can then commence just to get a sense of how much of the previous evidence on TNA you may be aware of in the Commission. You were in attendance for Mr. Pomensky's evidence at the Commission hearing, is that right?
Correct, yes, I was here.
I think that's because you thought you might come on as a witness, but unfortunately it took a bit longer than we'd expected. I apologize for that. And then in relation to Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Chweyu, were you aware of their evidence? Did you watch it? Did you listen?
Chair, I did listen to some of it, because not all of it was broadcast, but I did get to hear some of it.
Thank you. It just helps me to know the extent to which the matters traversed there might be known to you. But wherever something is unclear, you should just indicate that to me, and then I can take you to documents, etc. Mr. Tsotsi, if we can then just begin with your background. Can you tell us what qualifications you hold, and then introduce for us when you joined Eskom and when you left Eskom?
Yes, I hold an honors degree in mathematics and chemistry. And I also hold an honors degree in chemical engineering, which I did at the University of Surrey in the UK. And I've post that done a number of management programs variously throughout the term of my employment, particularly at Eskom. I joined Eskom as an employee in 1995, and I worked in two specific areas when I was at Eskom. I was a senior manager, first and foremost responsible for environmental affairs in the company. I then proceeded some years later to what we called corporate strategy. So I was head of corporate strategy at Eskom for, could have been about 4 years before I left. I eventually left the company in 2004.
And then you returned to the board of Eskom, is that correct?
Yes, I returned to the board of Eskom in 2011 as chairman of the company.
And until what time did you maintain that position?
I was chairman of the company until the end of March in 2015.
Having started when, in which year, as chairperson of the board?
I started as the chairman on around August of 2011. There was the first term, which ended on the 8th of December, or the 11th of December rather, 2014. And then my second stint as chairman was from then until, I'd say about the 30th of March, 2015.
You only served as chairperson of the board. You never served as an ordinary member of the board.
That is correct, Chair.
Okay.
Chair, I may have in the introduction said something incorrect there, so the clarification is useful.
Yes.
Where Mr. Tsotsi in his affidavit spoke about being appointed to the board of directors in August of 2018. Mr. Tsotsi, you'll see that at page 1 and paragraph 2.1. On that page, you later talk about saying you were further appointed as the chairman. And so it was my error to assume you'd held a position as a non-executive member but not chairman prior to holding the position of chairman. So I thank you for that clarification. You were chair, just to be clear, from your appointment in August 2011. Is that right?
Yes, that's
Thank
correct.
you. Thank you. If we can then go over the page, Mr. Tsotsi, to page 2 of your affidavit.
Okay, I'm just trying to find it.
It's right at the beginning. Oh, let me orientate you. The pages are in the top right-hand corner. So if you turn over that first pink division,
Got it.
you've got it.
Yes.
Excellent. And when I refer to page numbers, you'll always be looking for the number in the top right-hand corner. So we're now at page 2 of the affidavit. And I'd like to pick it up at paragraph 3.1, if we may there. You talk there about TNA Media. That's where you introduce it in the affidavit. And you state there that TNA Media had a contractual relationship with Eskom prior to my arrival as a director of the company. Do you see that?
Yes.
Why do you say that a contractual relationship existed prior to August 2011?
I understood when I arrived at Eskom that the company had a contract with TNA Media. This is prior to my arrival as chairman of the company.
Do you recall who gave you that impression?
This would have been the chief executive.
And who was that at the time?
That was Brian Damas.
Thank you. And you go on and say at paragraph 3.2 what had happened with that contract. Can you tell us about that?
My understanding is that there had been a renewal of that contract at some point. I can't recall what the dates were. And that during my term of office, there was again another renewal, which would have been, I'm not sure whether it's the second or third renewal.
And what gave you the understanding that the last of those was a renewal?
Well, my understanding that it was a renewal is because there was no particular process we understood that the people responsible for engaging service providers went into, other than just simply negotiating a contract. So I presume that, in effect, what was happening was that it was being updated from what it was previously.
Did you make inquiries in that regard?
No, I did not make inquiries in that regard for the simple reason that these matters are normally operational matters that are dealt with by the executives and would not necessarily come to the board unless there was a particular situation that caused them to come to the board.
Mr. Tsotsi, I focus on those two aspects because the evidence before the Commission thus far, through the evidence of Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Chweyu and Mr. Pimensky, well, the latter to a lesser degree because Mr. Pimensky only entered the board in December of 2014. So let's focus for now on the evidence of Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Chweyu. They've taken us through the first two contracts that Eskom entered into with TNA. And the first contract, you may be aware from their evidence, and I can certainly take you to documents where it might be relevant for you to do so. But my hope is we can just move over this so that we get some common ground as to the contracts that existed prior to the elevation of the matters to the board of Eskom, which is really where you have personal knowledge of the events. But if at any point you have a reason to dispute or question what I'm telling you the evidence led thus far has been, please raise it, and then we can go to the documents. But the evidence thus far is that the first contract was concluded in April of 2012, so not prior to your arrival. Does that come as a surprise to you?
It does come as a surprise. It does, certainly.
Why do you think you would have been told that there was a contract in existence already if there wasn't?
I don't know. I can't answer that. I don't know.
The first contract was for 6 business breakfasts. Do you know what business breakfasts are in the context of TNA?
Yes.
Thank you. And that was for to a value of 7.85 million. And that contract was going to run from the 1st of April 2012 to the 31st of March 2013. As you sit here now, are you aware of those facts or not?
I'm not aware of the dates, but I'm just aware of the business breakfasts.
Indeed. And the evidence of Mr. Chweyu and Mr. Pretorius was that there was then a second contract concluded in November of 2012, and that was for a further 4 breakfasts. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of the breakfast, yes.
But the fact that the second contract was concluded in November 2012, are you aware of that fact?
No, I would not have been aware of that.
Do you know where the processes were followed before those contracts were entered into?
No, Chair, I would not have been privy to that information at that time.
And did you know whether those contracts were concluded when there was budget available for them or not?
That too I would not have been privy to, so I would not know.
There was a point in time where parliamentary questions started to come to Eskom because there was some interest in the extent to which state-owned entities were contracting with TNA. Were you involved in those questions and answers?
I don't recall being involved in those questions because ordinarily when Parliament requests Eskom to appear before it, it is the management that goes and appears before the parliamentary committee. And we as board would only know if there was an issue that has been escalated to the board. But otherwise, we would only know insofar as what would be in the public domain, as anybody else would.
The engagements from the Public Protector's Office with Eskom, were you involved in those interactions?
The Public Protector, at some point in this whole TNA matter, did write to me, and what normally happens is I would pass on that correspondence to management and ask them to respond appropriately, and that's what happened.
Thank you. We'll certainly go to the Public Protector engagements in a bit more detail later in your evidence. But at the moment, we were dealing with the second contract. Now, the second contract, the Commission has heard in evidence, concluded on the 31st of March 2013. Were you aware of that?
I'm not aware of the specific dates, no.
And the contract that did come to the board's attention, the third contract, the contract that Mr. Majula entered into, to the value of 43 million, when did that come about? Do you recall its time period?
I only recall the fact that Mr. Majula entered into that contract at the beginning of April, which is what was reported to the board.
That would be April 2014,
2014,
is that correct?
yes.
Certainly the evidence before the Commission indicates that between the end of March 2013 and April 2014, there was no contract with TNA. Were you aware of that?
Not specifically, no.
The reason why I raise it is because I'm just interested in your use of the word renewal, that these contracts were being renewed. Because certainly there was a big gap in time between the end of the second contract and the conclusion of the third contract. Did you have an understanding that the third contract was just a renewal of the previous one?
That is the understanding that I had, Chairman.
And who gave you that understanding?
I got the understanding from the presentation which was given to us from the Audit and Risk Committee when they informed the board about this problem with the contract at that time.
You see, Mr. Treye's evidence before the Commission was that there was a lot of, I think he might have said, heat on Eskom towards the end, well, during the course of 2013 and 2014, because there were parliamentary questions that started late in 2012, and then there was the Public Protector's engagement with Eskom about TNA, and his evidence was he therefore was not inclined after that second contract to contract with TNA until at least April of 2014, when Mr. Majula was appointed as the chief executive of Eskom. Are you aware of any of that context?
No, I'm not aware of it. I would only become aware of it if there was a particular reference to it in any of the board meetings or any of the reports that came from management. And usually those would come because the board has either to make a decision or the board needs to know.
Did the board ever engage Mr. Treye at all about the 43 million rand contract?
Not whilst I was at Eskom, no.
If we can go to one of the bundles in front of you, which is Exhibit MM1. That is the bundle containing Mr. Pretorius's evidence, Chair. And if we can pick that up, apologies, it will be MM1B, the second of the volumes, and we'll pick it up at page 731.
What page?
731. If you go over the page, apologies, Mr. Tsotsi.
Yes.
You have, excellent. If you go over the page to page 732, you'll find the date of this letter, which is 30 August 2013. On its face, it's a letter written by Minister Gigaba to yourself. Do you recall this letter?
Not unless I read it to
Of
remind
course.
myself.
Please take an
Yes,
opportunity.
yes.
Yes, I see, I've read it.
Do you recall receiving it?
Ms. Hofmeyer, maybe what we should do, if there are going to be quite a few of those letters that you will refer him to, which he has not had a chance to read, maybe what you could do for the next ones, if there will be, is to tell him the main points of what it says, and if he looks that he might just remember quickly, but if he needs to read it, or if he's going to need to read all of them fully, we might have to just find time and give about 30 minutes. You identify all the letters that you will refer him to. He reads all of them, so when we come back, it could be much quicker.
Certainly, Chair.
Yes.
I
Yes.
propose that we endeavour on the first option, which is I can just highlight the
Yes.
salient points.
Yes.
But at
Yes.
any point, if you'd like to take more time, Mr. Tsotsi, please let us know.
Yes. Okay.
So, on the face of it, this is a letter from Minister Gigaba to yourself indicating that the public protector has engaged his department and is asking questions about spend with the TNA media. Do you recall receiving this letter in around August of 2013?
I do recall the letter, yes.
And your evidence earlier was that you would then have handed it over to management to deal with the response. Is that what happened in this occasion?
Yes.
Thank you. And I'll take you to the response that management provided. It is contained at page 749 of the same bundle, Exhibit MM1B. You'll see that that is a letter dated the 19th of November 2013. Chair, we did deal with this in evidence previously, but you'll see sort of maybe a quarter of the way down, there's draft indicated on the first page of the letter 749. The evidence has established that was actually an error. It wasn't the draft. It's the actual letter that finally went to the public protector because
Yes.
in later correspondence, she attaches this letter which she received. So it appears to have been an error to retain draft. It
Oh,
was the
okay.
final letter.
Okay.
And if you go over to page 751, you'll see that it was signed there by Mr.
Yes.
Duplessis, the General Manager, Legal Specialist within Eskom. Mr.
Yes.
Tsotsi, do you recall ever seeing this letter before it was sent to the public protector?
Did
I
you
don't
tell him
recall
what it
ever
was
seeing
about?
it, yeah.
You did,
Well, it was
yeah.
the response to her request for information about allegations of fruitless and wasteful expenditure on the part of Eskom with TNA. And as I understood your evidence, you handed that over to management to prepare a response. What I'm interested to know is, in that process, would you have asked to see the letter before it went back. We can go to whether you had sight of this particular letter. But let's first deal with the process. Would it come back to you before Eskom's response went to the public protector, ordinarily?
Ordinarily, the legal counsel would inform me that they have responded to the letter that came, because the letter was written to me, and they would then just brief me about what their response has been. But I'm afraid I don't recall, Chair, at that time. Yes.
So you would not necessarily see the response.
I would not necessarily see the response, no, but I would be briefed as to what
the response was.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
If I may, I'd like to take you just to a few aspects of the response, because the evidence that the Commission has already heard indicates that there were aspects of what was stated in this letter that were false at the time that they were stated. And I understand your evidence to be, you were told that there was a response, but you may well not have looked at the text of the response before it was sent out. But let me take you to the aspects which appear to be false on the basis of the evidence the Commission has received. If we start at page 749, in the second paragraph, it says there that Eskom was approached during the first quarter of 2012 by the New Age newspaper to sponsor some of the business briefing breakfasts it was arranging. And then if you go down to the bottom, the last sentence of that paragraph, what is recorded there is a reference to the program. Now, the program is the 49M campaign. Are you aware of that campaign?
Yes, I am.
And it's a reference to the following. As the program had an approved budget, it was not necessary to obtain board approval for the sponsorship or normal sponsorship approval. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, the facts that have been revealed in the Commission are, in summary, the following. When the first contract was concluded, there was no budget at all for it. What then had to happen is, after it was concluded, Mr. Pretorius had to go to ICAS. That is, let me just, can you help me with the acronym, ICAS? It is the...
He might have forgotten over the
Indeed.
years.
I have forgotten, Chair.
Indeed.
Okay.
It is the Investment Committee. Sorry, I will find it in a moment. The Investment and Capital Assurance Committee. Right, so Mr. Pretorius had to go to the Investment and Capital Assurance Committee after the contract was entered into to get an approval for 6 million of the 44.4 million rand budget that was being assigned to the 49M to be assigned to the first 6 business breakfasts. Were you aware of those facts at the time?
No, I would not have been aware of those facts at all.
And then the second contract was concluded after Mr. Chweyu had gone for approval for further budget for the second contract, but the entire sponsorship committee, except himself and one other person, had voted against entering into the second contract and approving a budget for it. Were you aware of those facts?
No, I was not aware of it.
So if you had been aware of them, would you have been concerned about the statement in the last sentence of this paragraph?
Do you just want to read that last sentence?
Indeed. It says, as the program had an approved budget, it was not necessary to obtain board approval for the sponsorship or normal sponsorship approval.
Well, first of all, they would not have required board approval.
Indeed.
But obviously, if there was no budget, clearly I would have, if I had the opportunity, I would have objected to that.
Then if we go to page 751, there's another aspect of this response that we've dealt with previously in the evidence of both Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Chweyu. Let me give you the background to the statement. One of the things that the public protector was interested in was whether these millions of rands that were being spent by state-owned enterprises on TNA and the business briefings weren't a wasteful and fruitless expenditure. And so one of the things that was asked, both by Parliament and the Public Protector, was, well, how have you assessed the value of Eskom's spend on these business briefings, right? Because Eskom should be spending money, I assume the thinking was, on things that give it value, derive benefit from it. Would you take any issue with that proposition?
Insofar as not assessing the value of the contract prior to spending the money, certainly that's what would be required.
So what Eskom was asked was, what does your research show about the impact of this spend, the spend with TNA, on your marketing endeavors to reach your audience, etc.? And what Mr. Pretorius's evidence indicated was that when they went back to the agencies that assisted Eskom with these sorts of measuring tools, the agency came back and said, well, we can't do this exercise because there's just no way of knowing when Eskom supports the TNA breakfast, for example, and puts the 49M logo on a screen behind the speaker, whether that's having any impact on people conserving their electricity use. So they said, we actually can't do an assessment of its impact. There just isn't a tool available for that. And they said the same in relation to newspaper advertising with TNA. Now, despite that backdrop, and we looked at the email correspondence with the agency at the time, called the Media Shop, what was put into this letter in response to the Public Protector at page 751, at paragraph 3, is the following. Recent research undertaken with regard to the 49M indicated that opportunities such as the sponsorship of business briefings contributed to a 73% awareness by the public of the 49M campaign. Now, would you have been concerned about that being included in this response to the Public Protector if you had been told about what the Media Shop had told Mr. Pretorius it was able to do insofar as research is concerned?
Insofar as, Chair, the assessment of the Media Shop, and if that was the only criteria that is available for Eskom to evaluate, then clearly they should not have stated what they've stated here.
Would you say it misrepresented the position?
It's a misrepresentation, yes.
Thank you. I'd then like to move to the third contract, because that's the contract, the 49 million rand contract, which Mr. Majula entered into in April of 2014, and that's the contract that came to the board's attention. And you had quite a level of involvement with that contract, did you not?
Certainly, yes.
Thank you. Now, in 2014, you've clarified for us you were the chairman of the Eskom board, is that right?
Correct.
And if we pick up your affidavit again, please, at page 2, where we were, that is exhibit MM6. Do you have that, Mr. Tsotsi?
What number?
We're at page 2, and I'd like to pick it up in the first paragraph on page 2, which is paragraph 2.2. You'll say you see in the second line there, the sentence begins, "For the most part, my tenure in the board was very smooth, until towards the end of the first board term, when Mr. Colin Majula was appointed as chief executive from about April 2014. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then at 2.3, you go on and say the instability set in when a whistleblower alleged to the Eskom board through the Audit and Risk Committee that Mr. Majula had not followed correct procedure as prescribed by the delegation of authority in awarding the renewal of the TNA media contract. Can you tell us a bit about Mr. Majula's appointment? How did that occur?
Chairman, this is a bit of a long-winded one, but let me try and see if I can recall. What happened was that when Brian Damas, who was the substantive chief executive at the time, was going to leave the company, the board then decided on two issues. Rather took a view on two issues, let me say. And the view the board took was that, first of all, we should not have any of the board members acting as chief executive, because we knew that between the time of Mr. Damas's departure and that of the inception of the next chief executive's term, there would be this period where we would require an acting chief executive. So that was the first thing the board had took a view on. The other matter that the board took a view on, in fact, on this one, it was really a decision. And the decision was that the board would ask one of the executives to avail themselves to act in that period. The individual that we asked was a gentleman named Steve Lennon.
Steve?
Steve Lennon.
Lennon.
Yes.
Yes. What was his position at the time?
He was an executive responsible for one of the portfolios of the company.
Yeah, okay.
Sustainability was, I think. And one of the reasons why we asked Steve in particular, apart from the fact that he was very experienced, was that he had declared that he would not be interested in contesting for the chief executive's position. So we felt that that was an easy thing to us to do, so that it does not prejudice anybody else who wishes to contest for the position. And so, as is normal, the board then instructed me to get the minister's consensus on this matter, as would be the case. And I met with the minister, and the minister was quite content and happy that Steve Lennon should act.
And who was the minister at the time?
This was Minister Gigaba.
Okay.
Yes. This was in, I think, around December of 2013 when we met. And what happened then was that just before the end of Brian Damas's term, which would have ended at the end of March 2014, I asked Steve Lennon to ask the EXCO team to have a strategic look at the business post Damas's time, to be able to form a view of how they see the organization going forward, so that when the new chief executive comes, at least they can engage him from the strategic standpoint to make it easier for him to have a better feel for where the organization's future should look like.
I'm sorry, Mr. Tsotsi, I don't know if I missed something. You spoke to the minister about approaching Mr. Lennon to be acting chief executive officer. The minister was happy with that. I expected you to then say you approached him, did he agree, and then move on, or are you still going there in terms of how events evolved?
Yes, Chair, I omitted to say that Dr. Lennon did agree.
Okay.
And I told him, of course, that the minister had consented to this.
Yes, and he assumed the duties in an acting capacity.
This is now before he assumed the duties.
Oh, before he assumed, but after you had spoken to him.
Yes, after it's spoken to him.
Yeah, okay, continue.
And then, as I said, the EXCO spent couple of days looking at the organization and taking a strategic view of how best to position the organization going forward. And in that process, when they came back, they had a configuration of the business which was slightly different from what existed at the time. And then, about that same time, just before Mr. Damas left, I got a phone call from Minister Gigaba. And he was quite irate. And this was an experience I'd never had with him before. And I was extremely taken aback. And his manner was very surprising. But I managed to calm him down and to have a proper conversation with him. And this was the time when we were about to go to the local government elections in 2014. And he was lambasting me or rather for the board, to have requested a white man to act when in fact we were facing, and the ANC was facing an election, the local government election. And this would prejudice.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I understand which year you are talking about. I thought it this was 2014, I think.
Yes, March of 2014.
2014, I think, was general election.
Was it general election?
Yeah, not local government,
Okay.
yeah.
Sorry
Okay,
about
all
that.
right. Okay.
Yes, and that we're facing an election, and here we are, we're appointing a white man to lead the organization, and this will prejudice the ANC's ability to attract, support, and I said in response to him that, look, I don't think we should be discussing this, certainly not over the phone. And I made it clear to him that I thought that this was not him speaking, that someone had put him up to this. And he then said
Were you
to
saying that because he had approved that you approach Mr. Lennon to act?
No. I was saying that in response to the statement he was making about me, us appointing a white man to act in that
yes.
position. And I said, this is not you. I mean, this is certainly not you. As far as I know you, someone has put you up to this. So let's just not get into this. If we wish to have a conversation, let's have a conversation. In any case, at the end of it all, he said he would write me a letter. And then he did write the letter. And the letter came, and basically the letter was saying that we should stop all attempts to, what is the word I'm looking for, to
recruit a new CEO?
No. To restructure. That's the word I was looking for.
Okay.
We should stop all attempts to restructure the organization until the new chief executive is in place. And then, following that, at a later date, prior to Brian Damas leaving, we're still at that point before Brian Damas was due to leave. He then asked me to inform the board that he would like Colin Majula to act. So I went back to the board.
I'm sorry, I may have missed something. Was that in the letter, or was there a subsequent conversation?
No, that was in a subsequent conversation.
Conversation.
Yes.
Okay.
And so I went back to the board and I informed the board, and the board was unhappy because this flew in the face of the decision that we had made that none of us as board members should be eligible to act in the position of chief executive. And of course, Mr. Majula was a board member at the time. So that is, to the best of my recollection, how Mr. Majula came to act as a chief executive. Now, when I say, Chairman, when I make the statement that my term, was a bit turbulent from about that time, this was as a result of quite frankly, the unhappiness of many board members about what transpired. And in particular, the fact that Colin Majula was acting as the chief executive.
Did you at any stage say to Minister Gigaba when he criticized you for what you say he called supporting white men to be acting chief executive of Eskom before elections, and when he said he wanted Mr. Majula to be the acting chief executive officer, did you ever say to him, but I consulted you on the board's contemplation to approach Mr. Lennon to be the acting chief executive officer, and you gave your blessing. What has changed now? What's wrong?
I certainly did. I don't recall whether it was during the conversation or afterwards, but I certainly made the point to him, just to remind him that we had the conversation, and he gave his consent to Dr. Lennon acting. And I obviously was perplexed as to why this change of mind.
Did he give you an explanation what has changed, what had caused him to change his mind?
No, he did not give me an explanation.
He did not?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tsotsi. You then go on at paragraph 2.3 on page 2 of your affidavit to talk about a whistleblower report regarding Mr. Majula's conduct on the 43 million rand contract with TNA. Can you tell us about what happened with the whistleblower report and how it was taken up further by Eskom?
I'm sorry, Ms. Hoffmeyer, and I'm sorry, Mr. Tsotsi. Just to conclude that part, did you, as chairperson of the board, then had the embarrassment of going to Mr. Lennon to say, sorry, we've been told that a board member must act. Sorry about that.
Chairman, I'm glad you've raised that because it was very embarrassing. And I felt, in a way, I don't know, it was a sense of guilt or whatever, but I did go back to Steve, and I couldn't, in all conscience, say to him what Gigaba told me.
Yes.
I just felt that I couldn't say what
Yes.
the minister had said.
Yes.
I don't recall exactly the excuse I gave him, but obviously this didn't go down very well with him.
Yes.
Already in the industry, the word was out that he was going to be acting.
Even among his colleagues.
Amongst his colleagues.
You had asked him to talk to them about the restructuring and whatever.
Precisely.
And they knew he was going to be the acting leader.
To that extent, Chair, Steve decided that as a result of that, he could no longer continue serving at Eskom. He felt that his integrity was somehow affronted by all of this. And he then requested to retire at that time. So it had a very unhappy ending for him.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Ms. Hofmeyer. You might have to repeat your question.
No, indeed. Actually, Chair, before I go to the whistleblower report, there's an aspect that's arisen out of your latest question. If I may just ask Mr. Tsotsi about it. Mr. Tsotsi, are you aware of the provisions of the Memorandum of Incorporation of Eskom for the appointment of the Chief Executive? Do you recall what those provisions say about who makes the final appointment decision?
When I was at Eskom, there was at the time, the minister had the prerogative to make that final appointment. But I understood that there was some change in the MOI on that issue. I don't recall exactly when that change happened, whether it was during my term or was it after, I don't recall.
Thank you. Certainly the version that we have, but I see that it is a September 2014 version, so it would have come after your time, is a version that said that the shareholder appoints the chief executive from a short list of candidates provided by the board. Was that operative at your time, or was that the new introduction?
Well, when we had the applications, we followed that method where we submitted a short list of 3 candidates to the minister. And this would have been after September 2014.
Yes, although I'm realizing as I ask the question, the appointment at this point, at the end of Mr. Damas's term,
Yes.
was an acting appointment, wasn't it?
Yes.
So who had the final say on acting appointments?
Well, I don't exactly know what the MOI says on that one, but in this instance, it was the minister who had the final say.
And instructed the board that it be Mr. Majula, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. If we can then move to the whistleblower report. Your affidavit indicates that there was a whistleblower report that went to the Audit and Risk Committee of Eskom. What then happened?
When the news broke that there was this incident pertaining to the signing of the TNA contract, the Audit and Risk Committee then informed the board, and they had made a determination prior to informing the board that this was an irregular process or irregular occurrence, and that this is something that they would like to have a forensic audit on to establish with some independent authority. In this instance, it was the S&G company, who then was asked by the Audit and Risk Committee to investigate just what happened.
Thank you. I'd like to go to some of the interactions that start to take place within Eskom after SNG was appointed. And for that purpose, I'd like you to go in Exhibit MM6, which is the one in front of you, to page 218. Mr. Majula, apologies, Mr. Tsotsi, you'll see at page 218, in the second half of the page is the first email that we should be looking at, and it's an email dated the 18th of September 2014, and it is from Mr. Colin Majula to Vusmuzi Masilela. Do you know who Mr. Masilela was?
Mr. Masilela was the gentleman who signed off on this SNG
So he was an
reported.
SNG employee, is that
Yes.
right? Thank you. And if you look at what Mr. Majula is saying to Mr. Masilela on that date in this email, the email reads, it's quite short, I'll just read it into the record. Dear Vusmuzi, I refer to the above review requested by the Audit and Risk Committee. You'll see the subject of the email is TNA contract review. Mr. Majula goes on, I've been informed by our company secretary that you have already met with some of the managers as part of the review. I need to point out that this is irregular, as I expected you to have informed me as the CE to ensure proper coordination. Be that as it may be, please indicate who else you need to interview, what documentation you require, and what key issues you would want to cover in these interviews. This is intended to facilitate productive outcomes of these meetings. Regards, Colin. Mr. Tsotsi, were you aware that Mr. Majula was engaging with SNG like this at the time?
No, I was not. This is the first time I see this email.
Would this sort of engagement have concerned you at the time if you'd been aware of it?
Considering the fact that he was the subject of this matter, I would have been surprised at him communicating with the SNG. However, he being the chief executive, the people who are supposed to be consulted by SNG report to him. So in a sense, I have an understanding of why he is involving himself, because it's his people. They report to him. But I would have expected that this kind of communication would have come from the ARC, not from him, for the simple reason that he was the subject of this investigation.
Indeed, and in fact, that's precisely what Mr. Masilela responds to Mr. Majula with, if you go to the email at the top of the page. Because Mr. Masilela, in summary, makes it clear that their mandate comes from the Audit and Risk Committee, and so they'll be engaging with the Audit and Risk Committee in this investigation, and not with Mr. Majula. They say they're happy to, and they will schedule a consultation with him. But do I have it that your evidence is it would not be appropriate for the subject matter of an investigation to be arranging when and who and on what documents the investigators have access to?
Yes, not only that, but he did not initiate the process. The process was initiated, and the party that initiated the process should take the responsibility.
Indeed. Let's then move in time to October. That was happening in September of 2014. We can now move to October of 2014, and if you'll pick it up at page 221 of the same bundle, that is exhibit MM6. Now, this is an email from Masilela Pukubuje. Who is that?
Mr. Masilela, this would be, well, there is a Masilela who was the company secretary. That's his first name.
Indeed.
So I'm not sure whether that refers to him.
I think it does, because if you just look at the bottom, sorry, no, it is Mr. Kupuje.
Kupuje, yes, that's it.
Who is the company secretary, if you
Yes.
see in the top line, writing to Mr. Masilela, who is the SNG person. Do you see that?
I see. Okay, sorry.
Certainly. Now, this is 16 October 2014. Do you recall when the SNG report was required to be provided on this review, the date that it was due?
It would have been around mid-November. I don't recall the date.
No, and in fairness to you, Mr. Tsotsi, it's many years ago. As we've been able to piece it together, it was actually on this date, the 16th of October, that ARC had requested that the report be provided to it.
Okay.
And so, as I understand this email, and let's take a look at what it says. It's from the company secretary, and it's written to Mr. Masilela at SNG. It says, "Dear Mr. Masilela, I refer to the above matter." The above matter in the subject line is TNA Media Contract Review Report. And write to you to advise you that our chairman of the board, Mr. Zola Tsotsi, has requested that you should not release the report regarding the review to Eskom until he has had an opportunity to meet with the chairman and CEO of SNG. Mr. Tsotsi, do you recall asking the company secretary to send out that email?
I don't recall, but I must have asked him, but I don't specifically recall, yes.
And what was your reason for doing so?
Chair, I needed to speak to the chief executive of SNG, and the reason I needed to speak to the lady was because Mr. Majula had clearly stated to me that the company is not treating him properly and fairly, and that he's reached a point where he has approached his lawyers and that he has in mind to litigate against Eskom, against the board, because he feels that he is not being treated fairly and correctly. So once I got this information from him and this feeling that he had, very strong feeling that he had, I then thought that this SNG report would invariably then become subject of evidence in a litigation. So I then decided, let me speak to SNG before they release the report to say to them, look, the board could be facing litigation, and I just want to be quite comfortable and certain that you are quite clear about whether you will be able to support what you have produced, the conclusions you've come to, whatever conclusions there may be, in a court of law. And that Eskom would be protected should there be any litigation against it. That was the reason, and that was the substance of what I talked about to her.
Mr. Tsotsi, in preparation for your evidence today, we obtained the transcript from the portfolio committee of your evidence before it in 2017, on the 22nd of November 2017. And in the course of your evidence before the portfolio committee, as it's reflected in the transcript, you talk about an interaction that you had with Mr. Tony Gupta, in which he, at the time that this issue of Mr. Majula's signing of the TNA contract for 43 million was being investigated by Eskom, and you indicate that in that interaction, Mr. Gupta said to you, "Why can't you make this problem go away?" Do you recall giving that evidence?
Yes, I do.
What I'm interested in, Mr. Tsotsi, is just trying to place that in time, that interaction, because your evidence before the portfolio committee, as we've read it, didn't make it clear exactly when in the course of this year, since April 2014, and Mr. Majula concluded the contract, that you had this interaction with Mr. Gupta. Can you help us with that? Did it, for example, precede this email on the 16th of October, where you ask for the report to be not to be released until you've spoken to the chief executive of SNG, or was it after that?
I honestly can't remember specifically whether it was before or after, but it was certainly after the issue was before the board.
Let's just go a little bit into a bit more detail about that interaction, because it was actually quite brief, your explanation of it as I have it from the transcript. Tell us how it comes about. Why are you interacting with Mr. Gupta, and where did this conversation take place, if it was a conversation?
Chair, to my recollection, this is one of the few occasions that I've had contact with Tony Gupta. He called me and he asked me if I could see him. And I said to him, the opportunity that I would have is when I'm going to a meeting in Pretoria. And he said, it's fine. Before I get to Pretoria, can I stop at the Sahara offices, which would be in Midrand?
Can I just interrupt you, Mr. Tsotsi? Do you recall whether this was the first contact you were having with him, or you knew each other or had been in touch with each other before?
Chair, we had been in touch before.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay.
So I then said, fine, and when the time came, I went and stopped at the Sahara offices, and indeed he was there, and I met him briefly. It was quite brief. He said to me, Chairman, we have a problem here that there is some issue to do with the signing of our contract, and that there is some problem which we don't exactly understand. And what we understood is that Mr. Majula did something wrong in signing this contract. So I said, okay, and then he says to me, well, you are the chairman, and as far as I'm concerned, this is a matter that you can deal with. So I asked him, how do you suppose I can deal with it? What is it that you want? So he said, what I would like to see happen is for this thing to go away. So can you make this thing go away?
The thing was the investigation. The reference to the thing, was it a reference to the investigation?
Well, I think it was investigation, which obviously was the thing that impeded the signing of the contract. So I'm assuming he's talking about that.
At least that was your understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I said to him, Tony, first of all, there are processes in the organization that have to be followed. Secondly, I don't have the operational authority to intervene in decisions that are made by management. And besides that, there is a formal process now underway, which is an inquiry into what transpired in the signing of this contract, and that I don't have the authority to prevent or interfere with. So I'm afraid I cannot help you. And he was, well, for the first time, I have to say, since I've dealt with him, he was visibly upset. And he did make a statement that it appears that I'm not interested in assisting him.
Please just repeat the statement that he made.
He said to me, it appears to him that I'm not interested in assisting him, which was a statement he was to make in a much more threatening way much later on. That's where the matter ended.
Oh, okay.
Can I ask just, Chair, we're at the tea break, but if I may just conclude this aspect, there are a few
Yeah.
follow-up questions. Was there anyone else in the room with you when you had this discussion with Mr. Gupta?
No, there was nobody else.
And again, to try and locate this conversation in time, I'm interested to know whether Mr. Gupta made any reference to invoices that had already been issued in relation to that contract that were unpaid. Did he make any reference to that?
Chair, I don't specifically recall that he made reference to invoices.
But is it fair, based on what you've said, to at least be able to locate the interaction in time after the investigation had commenced? Because I understand part of what you said to Mr. Gupta is there's a formal process underway and I don't have any authority to prevent it. So can we at least say it happened at some point after SNG was appointed by ARC to run the investigation?
It was during the time of the investigation, certainly, yes. But exactly at what stage, I don't recall.
Thank you. Thank you. Chair, it may be convenient to take the tea break now.
Okay, we'll take the tea break now. It's 20 past on my watch, and we will resume at 25 to 12. We adjourn.
All rise.
Yes, we may proceed.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Tsotsi, we are in around October 2014 at the moment, if we're following the chronology of events, because you'll recall that email that the company secretary sent out asking for the report not to be released until you'd engaged with the chief executive of SNG was dated about the 16th of October. Were you aware at that time about media reporting regarding this contract?
I don't specifically recall media reporting about this contract.
Okay. But would it surprise you to learn that...
Sorry, Chair, just in terms of timing, I do know that there were media reports about this contract, but in terms of timing precisely,
right.
I don't recall when.
Well, I don't need to take you to them, but certainly the first one that we were able to find was a Mail and Guardian report of the 24th of October, and then there's a later one in November. So it's around the end of October, it seems from our investigations, that the media gets wind of this, understands that the board, that the allegations are Mr. Majula entered into the contract without authority, and there's some concern about whether committing 43 million rand at this stage of Eskom's precarious financial position to TNA Media is a sensible decision to take. Do you recall being aware generally of those reports?
Yes, I am. I am aware.
I'd then like to go to the end of October, the 29th of October, because on that date you received a letter from the Public Protector. You'll remember that there was that previous engagement in 2013 that we dealt with around August, where Minister Gigaba writes to you because the Public Protector is interested in generally SOEs and their contracting with TNA, and the response to that was produced and signed by Mr. Du Plessis, and we looked at that response. Our investigation reveals the second time that the Public Protector engaged Eskom in relation to these matters occurred on the 29th of October 2014. And you'll find her letter in your bundle, which is MM6, at page 364. Mr. Tsotsi, you'll see that this is a letter dated 29 October 2014. It's addressed to you, and over the page it appears to be signed by Advocate Madonsela when she was in the Office of the Public Protector. Do you recall this engagement towards the end of October 2014?
Yes, I do remember.
Let's just look at what Ms. Madonsela, Advocate Madonsela, was saying at the time. In paragraph 1, she refers to the letter from Mr. Du Plessis dated 19 November, and she indicates to you that she's finalizing the investigation and she's in the process of drafting a provisional report. Do you see that?
Yes.
She goes on and she says, it's since come to my attention through the media. So you'll recall I indicated to you the Mail and Guardian reporting that we've managed to find was 24 October. So within about 5 days, she appears to be writing this letter. And she says that she's learned through the media that notwithstanding her ongoing investigation of the above matter, Eskom's former interim chief executive officer, Mr. Majula, has subsequently entered into a new and similar breakfast sponsorship deal worth 43 million with the New Age newspaper. And if you go over that page, she says it's been further alleged that the new deal was concluded against the advice of the board and in total disregard of internal legal advice. The deal is also alleged to be an audit risk as it exceeded the sponsorship budget. And she goes on at paragraph 5 on that page to say, in the interest of cooperative governance, transparency, and accountability, I implore that Eskom's new sponsorship deal with the New Age newspaper should be held in abeyance pending the release of my provisional report. And then she asks for certain documents to assist her. She wants the minutes of the board meetings and resolutions where the new agreement was deliberated upon, and she wants a copy of the 43 million rand contract between TNA and Eskom. Do you see that?
Yes.
What did you do in response to this letter?
Chair, as was the practice, I asked our legal department to look at this letter and respond appropriately. And then they would have done so and come back to me with a letter for me to sign.
Thank you. We'll pick up that letter in due course, if we may, your response back to her. At the moment, I'm just trying to follow the chronology, because that response ends up actually only going back to her on the 9th of December, but we'll get to it in a moment, if we may. Now, she makes reference to, in this letter, Eskom's former interim chief executive officer, Mr. Majula. Do you recall that at page 346 at the bottom at paragraph 2?
346.
Sorry, 364, apologies, I've inverted the numbers. 364. At paragraph 2 at the bottom there, she says, the media indicates that Eskom's former interim chief executive officer, Mr. Colin Majula, has subsequently entered into a new and similar breakfast sponsorship. Do you see that?
Yes.
She's referring to him as the former interim chief executive officer. So what has happened to Mr. Majula by this stage?
No, nothing. As far as I can recall, he was still the interim chief executive.
Do you remember when he ceased being the interim chief executive?
Chair, this probably would have been sometime in, is it early December?
Our
I
records seem
suspect.
to indicate it was a few days after this, at the end of October 2014.
Was it?
With that, but after Ms. Modinsela's letter, certainly.
Yes.
But the records that we've obtained from Eskom indicate he held the position until 31 October 2014. Do you recall who replaced him?
No, the likelihood is that the substantive chief executive would have been in place by then, following him.
Mr. Matona.
Mr. Matuna, yes.
Certainly, our investigations reveal that Mr. Matona was in that position from 1 November. Why was Mr. Majula removed as interim chief executive at the end of October?
Well, the reason was because the process of appointing a new chief executive had been completed, and that Mr. Matuna was available to take up the position as of the 1st of November.
So it had nothing to do with his involvement in the TNA contract?
No.
And what position did Mr. Majula then hold at Eskom when he was no longer interim chief executive?
Well, he reverted back to his position he was, which was he was a member of the board.
And do you recall how long he held that position?
That's when I think the early December comes into the picture. I think he, yeah, because I was thinking about his actual departure from Eskom.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he left Eskom in early December.
Yes. Was it in the reshuffle? Because remember, the reshuffle happens on the 11th of December. And as I understand the facts, and we've had these facts presented in evidence before the Commission, he was not one of the board members who was kept on in the new board. Is that right?
Yes, but I think there's more to it than that. I think, I stand to be corrected here, Chair, I think he actually resigned from the board before the board's term was over.
Thank you. And that would have been some date in December, but before 11 December, because
Yes.
that's the date of the change. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. So at no point was there any decision to move him out of a chief executive role because of the investigation in the TNA matter. It was simply that the process for the new chief executive had completed. Is that right?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, the next thing that happens is on the 7th of November 2014, the ARC chairperson, Ms. Latuli, sends the SNG report to the board. Do you recall that?
I recall that action, yes.
Yes. I don't think we need to go there. Just for the record, it appears in your bundle MM6 at page 233. So on the 7th of November, the board of Eskom gets the SNG report, and it's circulated by the ARC chairperson. And then if we follow the chronology, Mr. Tsotsi, there's a series of board meetings that follow receipt of that report. Do you recall those board meetings?
I do recall, Chair, the fact that there were a number of board meetings.
Well, let's go to each of them if we may, and we'll now need to move into the bundle containing Mr. Pamensky's evidence, because we dealt with this first with him. You'll find that in Exhibit MM3, and we need to go to page 336 in that bundle. Thank you. Now, you'll see 336 is a document entitled Minutes of the Eskom Board Meeting. And then there's a particular number given to the board meeting held on 24 November 2014 in a relevant boardroom at Megawatt Park from 5 in the evening. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Tsotsi, before we go into what's recorded about this meeting in the minutes, can you just tell us, alongside SNG's investigation into this matter, there were the interim financial results of Eskom that needed to be finalized. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what issue had SNG raised in relation to those financial statements around the TNA contract for 43 million?
Okay, Chair, the issue for the auditors was that because there was an alleged irregularity, the audit regulator requires that this be reported in the financial statements. And so we had an engagement with the auditors, who then explained to the board precisely what steps need to be taken in regards to addressing an irregularity in the financial statements.
Indeed, as we've previously looked at the interim financial statements in Mr. Pamensky's evidence, but they did disclose in those interim financial results that there was this allegation of irregular expenditure and that the board was presently considering the findings of the review that had been conducted. Now, as I have it, this meeting that you convened on the 24th of November was precisely to deal with how this was going to be reported in the interim financial statements. Does that accord with your memory?
Yes.
Let's go then to page 337. Because in this, were you present at this meeting, Mr. Tsotsi?
Yes, I was present at this meeting.
And you were in the position of chair at that stage, correct?
Correct.
So when we see at page 337, midway down the page, just after the middle of the page, there's a paragraph there that says the chairman reported that he'd received an email from Mr. Majula in response to Ms. Masitela's email around the legality of the previous day's proceedings. At the request of members, it was read out for the record as follows verbatim. And then it appears that you read the whole of Mr. Majula's email to you. Do you recall this?
Yes, I do.
And if you go on, we won't go through it in too much detail, but what was your understanding of Mr. Majula's chief complaint at that stage?
Okay, Mr. Majula's complaint had to do with principally two things. The first one was that he was contending that he is alleged to have committed an irregularity, and yet there's no, essentially saying there's no evidence to that effect, and that he's being accused of having committed something which nobody has proved to have taken place. The other thing that he was very concerned with, and he linked this to the first one, was that he had approached me and complained to me that, in fact, the chairperson of the ARC, Ms. Luthuli, and I recall he indicated that the FD at the time also had some relationship or contact with a certain company which he felt was an irregular, because this company was a service provider to Eskom, or was contending to be a service provider to Eskom. And then he felt that these individuals should also be subjected to an inquiry in the same way that he is being subjected to an inquiry, because their irregularity, as he indicated, was as much an irregularity that should be investigated as his is being investigated. So that was the essence. I've not read this letter, but that's the essence of what I recall he was complaining about.
And Ms. Tsotsi, you made reference to the FD, the financial director. Who was that at the time?
That was Tsulufelo Molefe.
And were you aware that it was Ms. Molefe, when she was sent the TNA contract signed by Mr. Majula, who first raised concerns about whether there was any budget at all for that contract, and also indicated that her understanding was that any contract that was going to be entered into with TNA was going to be of a much smaller proportion. It was going to be for 1 year and 12 breakfasts rather than 3 years, and I think what ended up being about 36 breakfasts. Were you aware of that at the time?
I was aware of some of the discussion that she raised on the board. I think the first issue you spoke of, I recall that she had raised that. I don't recall the bit about the contract being 1 year versus 3 years. That bit I don't remember, but the first one I do.
We don't need to go there. We looked at it with Mr. Chweyu, Chair, but when she has sent the contract from Mr. Chweyu on the 7th of May 2014, her response to receiving the signed contract for 43 million in 3 years is, and I'll just read it into the record, she addresses it to Chose, Mr. Chweyu's first name. I thought you said the contract was for a 12-month period for 12 briefings only and to be aligned with Eskom's sponsorship framework and strategy. I don't understand why the contract value is now 43.2 million. To my understanding, the total sponsorship budget was around 30 million. Any unbudgeted expenditure must get approval from IFC. So is your evidence you weren't aware of those complaints that she'd made at the time?
No, I wouldn't have been.
But certainly there had been a whole investigation that was going to unfold and had been completed by the stage of this meeting. And SNG, what do you recall SNG concluded about whether there was an irregularity in the process?
I recall two, shall I say, principal conclusions that SNG came to. One was the fact that there was indeed an irregularity that had occurred at the instance of Mr. Majula by assuming that the contract fell under the delegation of authority of what you called investment as against sponsorship. And hence, he did not follow the guidelines that were set out for a contract that fell under sponsorship. The other conclusion that I recall is that the contract, or rather the termination clause in the contract had been removed. Again, at the instance of, I don't recall whether it was both Mr. Majula and Mr. Cho, or at the instance of Mr. Cho. But that was one of the conclusions that she came to. I would have to read the conclusions to refresh myself further.
Well, can I say your memory is very good, Mr. Tsotsi, because that, as we have it, and we've probably read it more recently, are precisely the conclusions that SNG draw. Subject to one or two revisions, do you recall them having concluded that that decision to remove the termination clause was against the advice of the legal department in Eskom?
Yes, that did come through in the board meeting. Yes.
And in relation to the first point, the irregularity, just to assist you in time, Mr. Majula's representations about it being an investment and not a sponsorship, I'm going to ask you about when precisely you received them, but they, on our best understanding of the chronology, actually came after the SNG report was finalized. So that view that was taken about investment and sponsorship is something that comes up later in the Ledwaba Mazwai opinion and the review that the legal firm was asked to do at the next board meeting. I'll take you to it. But just to be clear, SNG, according to the report and your good recollection of it, concluded he did not fall within the delegation of authority, Mr. Majula, when he concluded the contract. And secondly, that he and or Mr. Chweyu were responsible for removing a termination clause in the contract against the advice of the legal department. Does that square with your recollection?
Yes.
Thank you. And then, Mr. Tsotsi, if you go on in the minutes of this meeting, you spent time, you read out Mr. Majula's entire email, and then, as we understand it, the remainder was really about what recording was going to be made in the interim financial statements around this issue. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And if we go finally to the end, it concludes that what the board is going to do and what the interim financial statements will reflect is that there has been a review, the board is considering the review, and is looking at implementing corrective action. Does that accord with your recollection?
Correct.
And we saw in Mr. Pomensky's evidence, Chair, that that is precisely what was then reflected in the interim financial statements. Also issued, it seems, on the same day as that meeting, the 24th of November, 2014. So now if we can move to the next meeting, and that occurred on the 3rd of December, and you'll find those minutes at 343 in the same bundle, exhibit MM3.
What's the page again?
343, Chair.
343.
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Tsotsi, did you attend this meeting on the 3rd of December 2014?
Yes, I did.
And if you go over the page to page 344, you'll see there under paragraph 7, which is headed TNA Sponsorship Legal Report. There's a report to the board that the chairman and the chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee had met with Ledwaba Mazwai to give them a brief for their investigation. Tell us about that. What was going on now by about the 3rd of December 2014?
Okay. One of the recommendations that came from the SNG report was that Eskom would be well advised to seek legal opinion as to how to proceed with the infraction occasioned by, or at least alleged infractions occasioned by the two gentlemen, Mr. Cho and Mr. Majula. In other words, what disciplinary steps can be taken and what position the company can take in that regard. And then we, as a board, then decided that let us commission a law firm which would look at this. And I think we extended the brief of the law firm really to look at not just that matter, but a few other matters. And I would have to look at the document to see what else we asked them to look at. But we did ask them to look at one or two things, because I think we're beginning to get concerned about a few things that were as a fallout, essentially, of the whole report.
Indeed. If we go to page 344, you'll see that Mr. Mazwai starts a report back, at least the minutes reflect, that he reported to the board, and that's the second paragraph under the heading TNA Sponsorship Legal Report. It records that Mr. Mazwai reported that a forensic review had been undertaken around the contract. He'd received the preliminary findings and had been requested to provide a legal opinion and what action should be undertaken against Mr. Majula and Mr. Chweyu, who'd facilitated the contract. And it goes on and records that Mr. Mazwai reported that because Mr. Majula was no longer the acting chief executive, this meant that he was no longer an employee of Eskom. Prior to his appointment as acting chief executive, Mr. Majula had been a non-executive member of the board. And then he records there that Mr. Chweyu still remained an employee of Eskom. Does that correctly reflect the facts at the time?
Correct.
Thank you. And if you go over the page to page 345, I'd like to draw your attention to the third paragraph from the bottom. It's recorded there that the decision around whether the contract could be regarded as an irregular expense depended on the view of the contract. And it's recorded there that if the contract was ratified, then there would be no irregularity. And it goes on to record that it was summarized that the complaint was that Mr. Majula exceeded his authority to approve and sign the TNA contract, and that Mr. Chweyu removed the termination clause against legal advice. It appeared that Mr. Majula was not aware that the termination clause had been removed. Do you recall any discussion about that, or where that statement came from, that Mr. Majula was not aware that the termination clause had been removed?
I don't specifically recall who said this, but I do recall that it was mentioned, yes.
You see, the challenge I have with that is In the evidence of Mr. Chweyu, we were able to track down the email correspondence between Mr. Chweyu and Mr. Majula around the final stages of the contract being concluded. And this was also confirmed in Mr. Chweyu's evidence. Mr. Chweyu, in fact, alerted Mr. Majula to the very fact that this termination clause had been removed. And he did so on the 2nd of May, 2014, prior to the contract finally being concluded. Was that brought to your attention at the time?
No, we would not have known about that at all.
It would be somewhat concerning to be proceeding on the basis that Mr. Majula had no knowledge that the termination clause had been removed if the facts were that it was drawn directly to his attention, wouldn't it?
Under the circumstances, I would think so, yes.
Chair, I don't suggest we go there. It has been dealt with in the evidence. But what Mr. Chweyu did on the 2nd of May 2014 is send directly to Mr. Majula, copied to Mr. Ndo, copies of the signed contract that he'd received from TNA. And he says, attached are 2 copies of the contract version signed by TNA. I had final discussions with them on Wednesday. We've reached agreement on almost all clauses, but still in dispute is the clause regarding termination. The TNA does not want Eskom to include the following clause. That was always going to be the clause that would give Eskom at its election a right to terminate on 30 days' notice. And Chair, you'll recall we received evidence from Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Chweyu that those sorts of termination clauses in contracts of this nature were standard at the time because of Eskom's precarious financial position. Eskom, you was in a financial state of great instability. The interim financial results, Mr. Tsotsi, indicated that you'd received 20 billion at that stage from government. Do you recall that?
Yes, 23 billion.
23. Every time I say 20, Mr. Pomensky also corrected me on that. Those of you who were in
It's
the
a
date...
lot of money.
It's a lot of money indeed.
I think so.
In this commission, 3 billion becomes part of what everyone's
It's
dealing
permissible to have aspirations.
with. Yes, indeed. So it was a 23 billion. And certainly, would you dispute the evidence of Mr. Pretorius? You said you needed a termination clause like this in a contract because you're committing 43 million rand of Eskom's budget to sponsorship. And the tides may change, and it might not be viable for Eskom to continue to commit that amount of money to a nice-to-have like sponsorship in a state of financial difficulty.
Yes, I certainly would.
Then if we can just go back to 345, where we were in bundle MM3. Because I want to pick it up in that second last paragraph. We've dealt with the point about Mr. Majula not being aware that the termination clause had been removed. But then the last sentence of that paragraph says, it was agreed that it was not the board's responsibility to take action against Mr. Chweyu, as he did not report to the board and was an employee of Eskom. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you recall a discussion around that issue?
Yes, I do.
And what was the nature of the discussion?
Essentially, what we were talking about there was, don't forget the lawyers are present at this meeting, if I recall well. If I just
That's
look at
indeed correct, yes.
Correct, yes. So they had then come up with a, shall I say, position, which simply stated that under the circumstances, would have to look to see what action, what recourse we can take to, in terms of disciplining the individuals who allegedly were involved here. Now, in the discussion, board felt that though the accountability rested with the board, the responsibility for the action that needed to be taken against an employee of the company would be that of the chief executive and management. That's where this comes from.
Mr. Tsotsi, was it a requirement for the members of the board of Eskom to familiarize themselves with the requirements of the Public Finance Management Act?
What do you mean, what are the requirements?
Well, were the members of the board of Eskom required to know what their responsibilities were under that act?
Yes, Chair. The reason I'm saying what I'm saying is precisely because of the understanding of the requirements of the PFMA, that the accountability rests with us to ensure that actions that need to be taken against any employee of the organization rest with the board. But the responsibility to carry out those actions is delegated to management. It does not absolve the board from not overseeing that those actions take place. But the actual responsibility for carrying out those actions rests with management. That is the understanding we have of the PFMA.
So just so that I can probe the understanding a bit further, did the board understand that it was, as the accounting authority of Eskom, ultimately responsible for ensuring that disciplinary steps were taken against an employee who breached the PFMA or engaged in irregular expenditure?
Yes, the board was quite aware of that, yes.
But as the matter of execution, you'd hand it over to management, the chief executive. Is that correct?
Yes.
You see, that's not as I read what is recorded here, and that's why I wanted to probe it with you. You see, what's recorded here is it was agreed that it was not the board's responsibility to take action against Mr. Chweyu, as he did not report to the board and was an employee of Eskom. Do you see how that, at least to me, but you're going to give us the benefit of the discussion and having been there, it seems to suggest that it's not the board's responsibility. Do you agree with me that that appears to be conveying that?
Well, since I was at the meeting, I would not, perhaps this may convey that to someone who's reading it, but certainly that was not what the intent was in the discussion.
That's very helpful.
Okay, I think we'll stop there.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Apologies, Chair.
No, that's all right. We're going to take the adjournment now. I'm thinking that if at all possible, maybe we shouldn't say we should not say we'll resume at 2. We should see if we could resume a little earlier than normal resumption time after lunch. I'm thinking about either 1:30 or 1:45. Either would be fine with you.
Absolutely, Chair, from our side.
Mr. Tsotsi, either would be fine with you?
Yes, Chair.
That's one. 1:45. I've had a request, Chair, just from the lawyers of Mr. Tsotsi that it be 1:45, if possible.
Oh, okay, all right. All right, let's resume then at 1:45. We adjourn.
All rise.